It had been said that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative to it. The slogan of the ultra-globalist movement, that another world is possible, seems to be reversed, and we learn that there is no alternative. This had been said by Margaret Thatcher, then Prime Minister. And when we read Mark Fisher's book, it is not that he confirms Thatcher, but that he says, actually, that capitalism is so deeply rooted and interpenetrated in daily life, in our system, in our formation, that it is nearly impossible to even think something else. And indeed, this is far from being new. It had been the core of what Marx said already in the first volume of The Capital. Capital comes dripping from head to foot, from every pore, with blood and dirt. So it is moving inside, is interpenetration, and it is as well whatever we express is as well from the same blood and dirt. In some respect, it may appear to be a paradox that capital and the capitalist mode of production are interpenetrated individuals and societies' life, while it seemingly is depoliticized and definitely depoliticizing, and scientifically, in the scientific view, this is definitely not that we talk anymore about political economy, but instead we are talking about economics. And this is this separation as a paradox, that we on the one hand have capitalism going deeply into everyday's life, into the structures, and at the same time, in the academic perspective, in the scientific analysis, we step back and say, this is not about anything that has to do with real life, but instead it is something where it is concerned calculations of abstract systems, of demand and supply, of value chains, neglecting this way the political side of it. It is a paradox, and nevertheless it is kind of a logical consequence of capitalism. And now I talk about industrial capitalism, the classical industrial capitalism is fully implemented, is fully recognized and appreciated, not only by individuals, but as a systematic factor. As the English language says, making a living. Making a living is not possible, nearly not possible, outside of the system. thinking about justice, we are inclined to say justice is about law. Of course, this is the rule of law governing our systems. And obviously, everybody is equal. It is the majestic equality of law that it forbids the beggars and the rich alike to sleep under the bridges and to steal bread. Anatole France. It is important to recognize this, and I think today we can get a confirmation of this state that with the establishment of a specifically defined mode of capitalist society, of capitalist production, we find exactly this depolitization, and vice versa, that if we arrive at a stage where the system is destabilizing, as it is now the case, we have a rejuvenation, if you want, re-referencing to political economy. We see this in the large circles, for instance, looking at the so-called Nobel laureates in economics, where you have this shift of strictly economics being awarded, and then you have the wider field of political economy or even psychologists contributing to economic research being awarded with what is still the most prestigious award you can avail of, even if it is in material terms actually relatively small, and it is only one amongst many others. In this way, I think it is important as well that we refrain from speaking of neoliberalism, this permanent reference to neoliberalism. Everything is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, if we take this term, is a hugely differentiated system in terms of the different strategies of deregulation or of regulation of deregulation. There is no such thing as deregulation in the poor sense, but it is always regulated deregulation, because otherwise the role of the state as ideal complete capitalist would not be guaranteed anymore. So it is this mode where we have exactly these points of shifting from political economy to economics and back and so on. In a nutshell, and initially, we have already this the core thesis with this. The reason for the political economy having lost its political focus is exactly this establishment, the full integration of the capitalist mode of production, and this means as well of reproduction. We always forget that production, in the Marxist sense, if we look at the introduction of to the contribution to the capital, to the political economy, we find exactly this point: production, reproduction, consumption, and exchange. This is an entity. Now, the full implementation of capitalist structures into the production means as well into the reproduction of daily life. This is important, meaning the differentiation is important, that we find then, of course, the political being distracted as matter of administration and management. Even we have social management. in different forms, in different with different focus. So this is the dividing line, and we forget in this way the integrity, in any case, of the entire system. Of course, this division or separation is hugely questionable, mainly questionable, because we have we have to consider the different steps of this development. They are more important, or the separation between them, the distinction between them is more important than actually the all-capturing phrase of neoliberalism. So what we have in the development is that initially finance capitalism, actually the finance system, is taking over and gaining its own strength or position, that we then have, based on this external power, building up the violent, and this is very important, the violent act of enclosures. And enclosures means the enclosure of land, but it means as well in mining, in other areas, just the occupation of space and time. This is another phase, and then we have with this actually the redefinition of poverty. The redefinition of property. This is a redefinition taking place in terms of political economy, very closely linked to philosophy, and we can take John Locke as one example. Initially saying, or not initially, he is saying that property, private property, is a fundamental right, but at the same time he defines this right, or he defines this property as being limited by what people actually can do with it, how they can manage the soil they have been, especially this, and how they can manage themselves what they have, this property. This system is now opened by way of saying this link is not a necessary link. We have on the one hand the legal property as ownership, and then we have the other property, another dimension of managing what is owned by others. It is, if we want to go so far, the emergence of an administrative capitalism, of management or manager capitalism, that is decisively defined by the separation of legal ownership and property in terms of being able to manage, being able to control it. They still gave the power to the manager and not to the workers, but in a way we can say this was actually a huge leap forward as a matter of socialization of production. Even there we have different shadows, we have different appearances of this system, but it is important to keep this in mind. And then moving on to new forms where we have new forms of finance capitalism and new forms of servicialization, where we have as one point this amazing separation of advertisement, of repair service, of information services, of programming when it comes to computers and stuff. We have this as a separate thing, not being considered being part of whatever we produce. This is, of course, very important when it comes to the characterization of employment conditions and of, if it's relevant, the not only finance minister, but as well others who claim their share. So we have this another very important point where we may talk about finance capitalism, where we may talk about service capitalism or whatsoever. There are different systems having the one root. With this, we have statements like, in the first part of the 20th century, the balance between owner and corporation, or between family and manager, tipped decidedly in favor of the corporation and the manager. Management became more powerful, technocracy blossomed. Ownership became subject to more and more state regulatory initiatives and controls. Organized labor tried to promote a new program challenging the decision-making authority of owners. Monetary disorders made long-term strategies of business development in the private sector very precarious. On the other hand, family life also became harder, and the expansion of the state and its claims affected the way in which family property could be transferred across generations. This goes hand in hand with the development of this, I nearly say, ancient or early capitalist orientation on property, where we find this orientation on what the close relationship between good, what is good, that is true, that is considered to be true, and that is useful. This is our little thing that we can deal with. And then we have, on the other hand, this corporation orientation. Corporation brought transformative changes for company organization, corporate governance, and the financing of enterprise. But the extent of these changes was not immediately apparent, and their implications were realized only incrementally. The new rules apparently gave great powers to owners, represented in general meetings, but the practice was different. As the owners often knew little about the meeting, the company, and about another, they found it hard to organize effectively at the general meetings. Information deficiencies rather than law tipped the power advantage to the managers. Hence, the attempts that began after the scandals and crashes of the 1870s and 1880s in France and Germany to introduce more regulation. The pendulum that had swung from heavy regulation to dramatic liberalization began to swing back to cautious regulation. And this is important to keep always the different actors of working class, of workers, of blue-collar workers, of managers and owners distinct. To be aware of it, to be aware of the overlap of different functions. So this is if you want, the mainstream orientation. But we have another orientation, the Marxist orientation, or the orientation between dialectical and historical materialism. This is what finally is important. And there we find an interesting shift. Again, that now in law as well, we find the explicit reference to law as a protective shield, so to say, that property had been what had been defined by property. Meaning, if you are working in this area, you have on the one hand the law, but it is exactly here where you have the leeway, where you have to decide, having a full fruit basket. The definition of in law is important. Katharina Pistor points this out. It is that law is now being instrumental as means of maintaining, but even of defining this capitalist system, and it is the way it defines it, the way or the orientation, the focus on the old question that is going throughout the entire topic we are talking about, cui bono. Who is benefiting from it? And then, of course, it means having equal law, but at the same time being implemented, being applied in different ways. From the rule of the law as guiding the state's policies, we find exactly the other way around, that law is instrumentalizing when it needs it. The others work in the service sector. I think it is important enough to highlight, once having been on a meeting in Birmingham, and it was about work organized by the European Commission, and I had been sitting, well, there had been large tables for the dinner, and I had been sitting there with a colleague friend from the UK, one of these people who can freely ask questions and nobody takes them, gets them in the wrong way. And he asked the waitress about the income. I don't remember if it was just at the threshold or if it was below the minimum income. And then we went on and we talked about the working conditions, short-term notice, we need you tomorrow evening, and if you say no, you can do it possibly twice, but that's it. So she talked about the difficulties of getting childcare and others. Was still happy to have something. We went afterwards to somebody from the commission, and they said there's a public advertisement of this job, and we only get the information, the results basically of this analysis. Everything had been legally fine, and that's the only thing that is of interest for us, leaving aside that the main thing is, of course, the question of price. Important is that this reflects as well the orientation we know from Mikhail Polanyi, where he said we have a change, the economy taken out of the market in this way, that it is not the broad concept of the wide market of interaction, but that, as he writes, other societies and other civilizations too were limited by the material conditions of their existence, and this is a common trait of all human life, indeed, of all life, whether religious or non-religious, materialist or spiritualist. All types of societies are limited by economic factors. 19th century civilization alone was economic in a different and distinctive sense, for it chose to base itself on a motive only rarely acknowledged as valid in the history of human societies, and certainly never before raised to the level of a justification of action and behavior in everyday life. Namely, again, the self-regulating market system was uniquely derived from this principle. This was the only orientation that had been relevant, taking it out of the market, even if it had been said, this is now the true market society and the orientation of the economic processes by the market. Another paradox, if you want, exactly the opposite of that what happens we find as real, not the reality, the empirical reality on how we live, how we make our life.